way to listen to the words of Christ Jesus.
Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
May Christ be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Good News according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Christ.
When Jesus had crossed again to the other shore in a boat, a large crowd gathered, and he stayed by the lakeside. Then one of the synagogue officials, Jairus by name, came up and seeing Jesus, fell down and pleaded earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is desperately sick. Come and lay your hands on her to make her better and save her life." Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed, pressing from all sides. Now, there was a woman who suffered from hemorrhages for 12 years. After long and painful treatment from various doctors, she had spent all she had without getting better. In fact, she was getting worse. She had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. "If I can touch even his hem," she told herself, "I will be well again." Immediately, the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately aware that the healing power had gone out from him, Jesus turned to the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" The disciples said, "You see how the crowd is pressing you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus continued to look around to see who had done it. Then the woman came forward, frightened and trembling, because she knew what had happened to her, and she fell at Jesus' feet and told him the whole truth. "My daughter," Jesus said, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be free of your affliction." While Jesus was still speaking, some people arrived from the house of the synagogue official to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why put the teacher to any further trouble?" But Jesus overheard the remark and said to the official, "Do not be afraid, just believe." Jesus allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James's brother John. They came to the official's house, and Jesus noticed all the commotion, with people weeping and wailing unrestrainedly. Jesus went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and crying? The child is not dead, but asleep." At this they began to ridicule him, and he told everyone to leave. Jesus took the child's mother and father and his own companions and entered the room where the child lay. Taking her hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." Immediately the girl, who was 12 years old, got up and began to walk about. At this, they were overcome with astonishment. Jesus gave the family strict orders not to let anyone know about it and told them to give the little girl something to eat. The good news of Christ Jesus.
Praise you, Lord.
great gospel. What a great gospel. And it's just like the readings that go before it definitely contribute to it, especially the reading from wisdom, which is always great to get reading from the book of wisdom. And that book of wisdom kind of foretells that God made goodness. God wants the best for us, and God hears us. And yet the words that really come to mind when we're reading the gospel is despair and desperation. And they're not the same meaning. They're definitely related to each other, but despair is complete loss of hope. And sometimes when we're in despair, we get a glimmer of becoming desperate, of just hoping that there might be something out there that's going to get us out of the predicament or dilemma that we are in. This morning, despair happened in our household, and that was with my granddaughter realizing she had lost an old necklace that was given to her by her grandparents. And to see a girl who is always finding joy to be just beside herself, and to give her the comfort of knowing that the sun is still going to rise in the east and it's still going to set in the west, and this is all solvable, and we'll be able to get there, and we have some life lessons to it, may have eased her a little bit, but she was also introduced to St. Anthony. And hopefully she will come through that despair and be able to get a stronger faith and maybe just some good life lesson that's there. I think we all know what personal despair is. We all have our stories of personal despair, whether it is something that we have learned with sicknesses that we have gone through, or when we have learned a loved one of ours is terminal. I definitely saw it in the nursing home, the despair that you would see on families' faces when their loved one was experiencing dementia and they knew the end was coming near. And even though it's the most common experience we all have in life, when you're going through it, especially the first time, it's despair and you don't know what else to do. And that's when the crying and the wailing out and this adherence to almost this instinctual response of, oh God, can you be there for me? Unjust legal situations, people being tried for situations where they don't know how they got into it. And I think Kafka writes about it the best in his fictional story of the trial of a man who's on trial and he doesn't even know why. And it's so fictional until it can really happen in real life. And you're again left to wail, oh God, where are you? And it's the understanding of Jesus on the cross. Why have you forsaken me? And we all can understand that desperation. And here we have in the gospel today, we have desperation happening. The first that we are introduced to is Jairus. I used to always call his name Jairus, and there was a friend of mine, a Holy Cross priest in Texas, and while he was in Texas, we had been going over this, I said Jairus, he goes, oh, you are. He goes, everybody here says it's Jairus, it's Jairus, John, it's Jairus. So if I go back and forth, that's speaking to me. But we have Jairus. And Jairus is in a desperate situation, and it kind of reminds me of the sorrowful mysteries. I think the sorrowful mysteries are an outline of our life in general, and we're constantly going through that first mystery of being in this agony in the garden of what am I going to do? What is the right or wrong situation in this? And you know that Jairus has definitely been through that. Here he is a synagogue official. His conference, his colleagues, they don't like Jesus. They talk about Jesus behind his back. Jesus is kind of an enemy of theirs. And Jairus is now knowing, do I go to this man or not? he's having to think pretty quickly, but nothing else is working, and his daughter is dying. And he goes straight to that second of the mysteries, which is the scourge. That scourge is sometimes something that we think of that is the most treacherous part of any ordeal that we're having to go through. But when you're going through the scourge, it's really not. Your mind is in a completely different place, and you really don't care about what anybody else is thinking anymore. You have an issue that's needing to have resolution, and you will do anything for it. And the love of his daughter gets Jairus to not care about what the crowd is going to think about him, to not care what his colleagues, to not care what the religious officials are thinking. He goes straight to him, please, please, it's a pleading. I know you can do this. Will you cure my daughter? And so he agrees that that's what he's going to do. But as he's doing that, he comes upon, or there is this woman in the crowd, and she touches the hem. She's going, can I get to the hem of his cloak? And we have to think about her. 12 years, 12 years of agony of having to go through this physical problem first, which must be just horrific, just in and of itself physically. What's happening to me? Why is this happening? But to know that there's a societal penalty for it, not with anything of her own doing. You know she's known in the community, and she's not known in a way that is one of honor, but with people pointing fingers. And she has endured this for 12 years. That psychological pain just must be outrageous. So much to the point that she has given every penny that she has with the doctors that are available to no avail, and told the problem is getting worse. What desperation. What desperation she must have been going through. And then she says, if I can just touch the hem of his cloak. And then we find out about the hem. What does that hem mean? That hem in Jewish culture is very important. Oh, it's actually a holiness, and it is where the early Jews would make their cloaks with the hem on it as a remembrance of the Ten Commandments and that they are the children of God. They would actually even sew in there a blue thread. So that hem is like, this is a touching of God. This is the touching of the promise. This is the touching of the covenant. And she's going, can I just touch that hem? All while she's doing this silently. And I think it's so important. Jesus has no idea who she is. He has no idea that there is somebody who is coming to him for healing. She hasn't. She is in her mind in this desperation of, please don't look at me, but here's this whole crowd around me. They must know who I am. And during this scourging moment, she really doesn't care anymore. It's, I've got to try. I've got to try. And she touches and is instantly healed. And Jesus is going, who touched me? Isn't that interesting? He doesn't know. He absolutely doesn't know, and yet the healing happens. And what's interesting is after she's healed, what does he call her? He calls her daughter. They've got to be around the same age. She can't be that much younger, but he calls her daughter. That's family. That's familial. And talks about how her faith has healed her. And for the first time in Mark's gospel, then he says, go in peace. And you have to wonder, what does that mean to go in peace, to finally let go of what has happened for 12 years, every day, probably some days, every second of that 24 hours in that day is this why has this happened to me? Why am I going through it? And it's gone. And you can go in peace and to let it go. And then he's then going and to the house of Jairus, where there is the 12-year-old girl. Her whole life, her entire existence is the pain the other woman has gone. And Jairus goes into the house and he does heal her. He tells her to wake up, but he doesn't call her daughter. Interestingly, he calls her little girl. Curious, and I don't even know what to make of that, or if I even have an answer for it, and maybe we might during our discussion. But is it because this is the daughter of Jairus, who is probably very suspicious of Jesus, or has been up until this point? And Jesus isn't necessarily wanting to cross a line right here and keeps everything in a maybe professional manner, because he's not doing the healing based on what are you going to do for me in the future. He's doing the healing because that's what's presented and that's what's supposed to be done without an expectation in return. If we're going to do the healing because that's what God has asked, that is the power I have through God to be able to do this. And so the healing is given, and it brings us back to the wisdom reading. God made everything. This is to make everything. And really important, I think, that Jesus is not asking of anything for this miracle. It's go on, go in peace for the girl, go have something to eat. Does this future speculation of what happened with Jairus, his daughter, or the bleeding woman influence Jesus' actions? They don't. He would have done it nonetheless. When we look at the Synoptic Gospels, there is that focus on Jesus' humanity. And I love this part because he feels the power to leave him. He's clueless on who touched him. Without her touching him, he would not have known to touch her. Did he learn more about himself that he didn't know before? And it definitely makes us ponder the terminology that we have of all-knowing. And I always think that it really begs to question any type of Calvinist mindset on predestination. Not even God knew who touched him to be healed, and yet the healing happened without him making it happen. It just happened because of the essence of him being there. What do we do with that? And isn't it wonderful? So what is our hope? Jesus hears our cry without regard to our worthiness. He even heals without being asked, without even knowing what is going to happen. We as humans, we might judge one another when we cry out for mercy, healing, or justice. We've all heard the murmurings before. You should have been prepared. It's your own fault. Well, that's what you get. But Jesus responds to the need presented. His arms are open. His love is poured out without condemnation or compensation. Where does that leave us today? Is this not good news? In our desperation that we have today in our own lives, do we find hope? And in our times of desperation, is that where we find our